The Apache tribes of the southwestern United States are speakers of Athabascan, geographically a widespread language family. Athabascan speakers are concentrated in the far northwest near Canada and Alaska. It is hypothesized that southern Athabascans are relatively recent newcomers to the southwest, and that small bands of nomadic Apaches filtered into the southwest. Apaches fought many other groups of natives during their migration and were credited as being nomadic raiders. They may have also learned and borrowed cultural elements from the groups they encountered. No Apache sites have been discovered in Texas, though it seems likely that they have been found but not recognized as Apache. The Spaniards were the first Europeans to encounter eastern Apache tribes in 1541. Near the beginning of the 17th century, Spanish explorer Juan de Oñate discovered an Apache village. At the end of the 17th century, the Spanish began to refer to the Apaches east of the Rio Grande with specific band names rather than Querecho, Teya, Vaquero, and Escanjaque. The Jicarilla Apaches were closely related to Lipan Apaches. In the beginning of the 18th century, Eastern Apache groups began raiding Spanish settlements. In response to this, the Spanish made their first retaliatory expedition against them in 1702. The 18th century also brought about raiding from the Comanches people, as well as the Wichitas upon the Eastern Apache groups. The Apaches were surrounded by enemies on all sides. The Lipan Apaches of Texas history were forced farther into Texas and Mexico as a result of Apache enemies. Once in Texas, Lipans came to be despised and known as renegades. Early Lipan Apaches had males customarily naked and women only being clothed from the waist down in clothing made of buckskin. In the summer, men wore a breechclout, leggings, and moccasins, and in the winter a buckskin shirt and blanket were added. The women wore a knee-length deerskin skirt, leggings fastened to a belt around their waist, and high moccasins. Younger girls beaded their dresses elaborately and often decorated their clothing with tin or brass. Children wore buckskins and only began to dress as adults near adulthood. Warriors cut off their hair on the left side of their head and allowed the hair on the right side to grow long. The long hair was normally folded and tied up. The left ear was pierced from 6 to 8 times, and on the right ear there was 1 or more piercings. Earrings were worn in all piercings on dress occasions. Men of the tribe believed that the face should be devoid of hair and that the body and face should instead be covered in paint. Women also wore earrings made of copper wire and beads. Their hair was usually worn in one long braid down their back, but was left unbound for special occasions. Throughout most of their history, Lipans primarily lived upon buffalo. Buffalo hunting was a group effort where hunt leaders were specially chosen, and under them sub-leaders were chosen to lead small groups of men. Afterwards, the hunters would surround the herd of buffalo, they would close in and begin shooting the animals from all sides with bows and sometimes guns. Lipans also hunted wild cattle and the cattle of ranchers as buffalo neared extinction. Lipans farmed several different crops, such as corn, beans, squash, and pumpkins, as a secondary subsistence activity. Apaches who did not raise their own crops would often go on an annual pilgrimage to the pueblos to trade for them. They were also known to raid many settlements during these annual pilgrimages for many resources. Apaches also used herds of dogs to transport food and other belongings. Lipans, among many other groups, made use of agave plants in basketry, the making of sandals, and as a resource for food. Lipans believed at birth that both lightning and a small whirlwind entered the body by way of the throat, and that this was what kept the body warm and alive. Childbirth took place within the teepee, with male members of the household excluded. Women gave birth in a kneeling position. After a child was born and washed, the mother would hold the child up to the 4 points of the compass and was shown to the sun. A mother was not supposed to nurse the child for 2 days. A few days after birth, children were named by their father, who would name their child after a natural object. Grandparents and children held particularly close relationships as grandparents taught the children about everyday behavior as well as information about the supernatural. Lipan boys matured as they were exposed to increasing hardships such as rolling around naked in the snow or exposing their bodies to the hot summer sun for long periods of time. Boys were also encouraged to become accustomed to danger to help develop them into better warriors. Lipan marriage was a contract between two families, with each member of the partnership having duties and responsibilities not only to the mate but to the mate's family. Men were expected to obtain permission to marry from a girl's father or a male relative. If the girl's parents agreed to the union, the bridegroom made them a gift of horses, firearms, and skins. Marriage obligated a man to perform certain duties for his wife's family, such as protection and breadwinning. If a man's wife dies, he is not released from his obligation and is instead remarried to another woman from the family. This was also the same in the case of a woman. She was not released from her deceased husband's family. Warfare was a major preoccupation of Lipan men, and in one way or another, it came to influence almost every phase of life. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the Lipans had little choice in the matter. For more than a century, the Comanches and their allies had carried on a war of extermination against the Lipans. In Lipan culture, one of the principal ways of earning prestige was to become a great warrior. Despite the accent on the war, there was a seldom, if ever, a time when even an entire band of Lipans engaged in a battle together. Typically, war parties consisted of from 8 to a dozen men. Any warrior could lead a war party, and only men who wished to do so joined a venture. Before a war party would leave for a raid, it was common for a ceremony to be performed by women of the band. During a raid, the war parties would approach on foot, either under the veil of night or in the early morning to surprise their enemy. If they were unable to surprise the enemy, then they may postpone or call off the attack. During battles, scalping Lipans would scalp enemies and would sometimes cut off body parts of fallen enemies and consume them. War parties would also take captives who were either tortured and killed after the warriors returned to camp or were adopted. Captured children, particularly boys, were used to herd horses. If the war party returned victorious with no casualties, they would return to camp singing so that the camp would come out and greet them. Once in camp, the warriors sat in a circle and the warriors began slapping their thighs in time with their singing. This song was followed by a victory dance which included a scalp dance. No victory dance was held, however, if a warrior had been lost. Captives of Lipans who were to be adopted were treated to a herring ceremony, which was like the custom of running the gauntlet. At the end of the ceremony, the boy became the son of the warrior who captured him. The central characteristics of Lipan beliefs and customs concerning death was a terror of ghosts. This fear led to the quick burial of the deceased, destruction of the dead person's property, and to immediate family moving its teepee following burial. 2 elderly persons were immediately chosen to care for a corpse when someone died. It was also preferred if one of the pair held some kind of supernatural power by which ghosts might be controlled. These caretakers washed the body, combed its hair, and dressed it in its best clothing and ornaments. During burials, the person's possessions were collected and tied with the body to a horse, which was led to the place of burial where a shallow grave for the body and its possessions were lowered into. The head of the body was placed towards the east, and before the grave was filled, a caretaker addressed the corpse and commanded it to leave peacefully for the afterworld. Food and water were placed with a corpse for its use during the journey. Normally, the favorite horse of the deceased was killed over the grave. The burial party would take a different route back to camp than the one they took with the corpse to prevent the ghost from returning to camp with them. The relatives of the deceased would then take measures to rid them of contamination and demonstrate their grief. Widows would show their grief by copious weeping and shaving the hair from their heads and tearing their clothing or throwing it away. Speaking the name of a dead person was especially avoided, and thoughts were suppressed to prevent drawing attention of ghosts. Lipan mythology included a culture hero, killer of enemies, who killed or otherwise disposed of various monsters and enemies. Before retiring from the affairs of men, he created deer, horses, other animals, and taught Lipans about warfare and raiding. In fact, Killer of Enemies founded all of the Lipan culture. A person became a shaman in the Lipan culture by having supernatural experiences. Theoretically, anybody could have these mystical or visionary experiences, but they seem to have been uncommon. The shaman's power to control and predict could be transformed from himself to another person. Normally, a shaman did not transfer their power till they were aged or felt that death was near. The reason being was that ceremonies and rites needed to be performed perfectly to be effective. If the powers were used incorrectly or misused, the supernatural powers were apt to punish the original holder. Shamanistic rites were conducted to cure the sick, help obtain game, to bring misfortune upon enemies, to foretell an enemy's approach, find lost objects, and to control the weather. Most shamanistic rites were performed before small family groups, but there were large gatherings in which the welfare of the whole people was at stake and in which all participated.